Welcome. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Welcome, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, to this webinar with Professor Richard Falk. State-sanctioned murder is what is going to be discussed. We have the US and our allies have a long history of carrying out targeted state-sanctioned murder of individuals around the world. This is something we've seen this, the assassination of high profile government officials and scientists that have actually taken place recently. Under the guise of fighting terrorism, the past 15 years have seen an unprecedented rise in the use of drones by the USA, whereby countless civilian lives have actually been lost. The loss of life has been normalized as collateral in war, but there is another dangerous environment being created where illegal extrajudicial killings of senior members of various governments in locations and nations that the USA is not at war with are being normalized as a modus operandi for the USA. And that's something that we really need to think about, grapple with, that we are creating sort of like a law of the jungle kind of scenario. And in order to deal with some of these issues, we've got someone I'm really pleased to welcome, an esteemed speaker, academic, Professor Richard Falk, who's a professor emeritus of international law at Princeton University and former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. Professor Richard Falk is also the Queen Mary University, London. So I'm really pleased to welcome him to this program. He'll be speaking on this issue of state-sanctioned murder, and after that there'll be an opportunity for question and answer to address any issues that you feel that have been raised as a result of Professor Richard Falk's talk, and to bring up anything else that perhaps you feel might be useful to have been included within this category and to be discussed. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to welcome and hand over to Professor Richard Falk and to speak about this particular topic for about 45 minutes.
Thank you so much, Raza, for that very kind introduction. And I'm very happy to have this opportunity to participate in this webinar. We meet at a time that is very appropriate for this theme because it's the first anniversary of the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, a leading Iranian political figure as well as the most respected military commander in the country, and very much popular among the Iranian people. And it's a very notable, highly visible example of state-sanctioned murder, because there was no effort to be discreet about this particular assassination. President Trump boasted about having succeeded in assassinating General Soleimani and some important companions with whom he was traveling. He ironically was in Iraq when struck by this drone attack, and at the invitation of the Iraqi Prime Minister on a diplomatic mission to try to ease tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So it was a multiply disruptive event that has a great deal of significance, as your introduction suggested. First of all, it was the most high-profile use of this technique of political assassination since the killing of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. And like that event, it was also in a country other than the country to which the targeted person had allegiance. So, and it was done without the permission, in fact, against the will of the government of Iraq. It was accentuated by the fact that Soleimani was in Iraq at the invitation of the most important political leader in the country. And in that sense, it was not only an example of targeted killing, it was also a violation of Iraqi state sovereignty. And it would have been also a violation of Iranian sovereignty had the event occurred in Iran, because, as you suggested in your introduction, US and Iran are not in a state of war, and therefore this was a violation of the most fundamental kind, not only of sovereign rights, but of the basic charter, UN charter prohibition on the use of international force in situations other than self-defense. And there was a report by the UN Special Rapporteur for extrajudicial executions that focused on this incident arising from the killing of General Soleimani. And her conclusion was that this was an act of war, not only a violation of General Soleimani's right to life and the idea of respecting the sovereignty of other countries, and certainly not acting without the consent of those countries. Even if the consent had been given, it would not have immunized this kind of premeditated and deliberate murder of the sort that is really quite shocking in its character. President Trump in the US, in his justification, said two things, both of which were characteristically false. He first said that this was a necessary act because General Soleimani had intended to head operations that were dangerous to American diplomats in Iraq. He presented no proof, and there was no indication that this was at all part of General Soleimani's mission, which was a diplomatic mission, a very sensitive one, and one carried out on an intergovernmental basis. And the second really quite extraordinary contention of Trump was that General Soleimani was the most notorious terrorist, and therefore his execution in this manner was justified as a counter-terrorist act. Anyone that is familiar with General Soleimani's career and role would know that he was, if anything, the leading counter-terrorist in the entire region of the Middle East. He had directed with great skill and effectiveness the struggle against ISIS or Daesh, and is widely felt to be responsible for its defeat and limitation. He had earlier been a leading force in Afghanistan that tried to contain and limit the role of the Taliban in that country. In essence, General Soleimani was a counter-terrorist resource of the most important kind. And the fact of claiming the opposite suggests how misleading state propaganda can become in the context of this sort of behavior. So what I think one is confronting here is a new kind of warfare in the world, in which a new technology associated with drones that are becoming more sophisticated and available to more countries are able to inflict destructive strikes on targeted individuals with no risk of casualties. They're different than the kind of covert special forces units that carry out these kinds of assassinations in the past. And it's important to mention that targeted killing of this kind, political assassinations, really goes back to the role of the CIA during the Cold War, where political assassination was used as a target secretly carried out with deniability and an effort to disguise the source of how this kind of political murder was carried out. The most spectacular example was probably Che Guevara back in 1965, who was killed with CIA assistance. He was captured in Bolivia and then executed with the complicity of the president of Bolivia at that time. The US, back in this Cold War period, repeatedly tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, head of state in Cuba, and also participated in the assassination of the Diem brothers, who were the leaders of South Vietnam in the early period of the Vietnam War back in 1963. So there's a history of more than half a century of this kind of behavior in which political assassination becomes a preferred instrument of a kind of war. It's not exactly the traditional war of military forces confronting one another, but it is a form of political violence that, as I have said, not only ignores sovereign rights, but also the human rights of the targeted person who is being eliminated without any kind of due process or evidence or any kind of protection of that person's right to life. One feature of the killing of General Soleimani is that he was not part of an anti-state political movement. Osama bin Laden was the head of Al-Qaeda, and even though that was also, in my judgment, an unlawful use of force, it was at least a use of force directed against a organization that did not have any claims of sovereign rights. In the case of Soleimani, not only was he a revered and leading personality in Iran, but he was a political figure very close to the supreme guide of the country. And as I suggested earlier, this could be taken as an act of war that would have engaged Iran had it chosen to respond in kind in a chain of behavior that could have led to a catastrophic war in the entire region, which is already suffering from a variety of chaotic circumstances brought about by Western, primarily US and Israeli interventions and uses of force. And I should say along this line that Israel, as well as the US, has been a practitioner of this kind of political murder. It has, for a long time, in a variety of countries, relied on Mossad, its secret equivalent to the CIA, to carry out these kinds of executions in foreign countries. It's eliminated political opponents, and it's eliminated those that it feels are politically engaged with groups that it designates as engaged in armed resistance to the Israeli occupation and domination of the Palestinian people. And it tried, it executed the leading figure in Hamas quite a long time ago, and more recently has targeted other Hamas figures living as private citizens, really, in a series of countries such as Egypt and Qatar. So there is a pattern here that suggests a new type of imperial warfare, and a new type of encounter that has no respect for sovereignty, no respect for the human rights of the person targeted, and really converts the world into a potential battlefield. In some sense, of course, the 9/11 attacks on the United States did create a new kind of confrontation between a non-state actor that could organize and strike from any place on the planet, potentially, and that created a sense that to deal with this sort of new security threat, it was justifiable to attack those sites where this sort of movement, political extremist movement, operated, especially in situations where the territorial government was unable or unwilling to address the threat. So that what one really had initiated, both through the Israeli response to Palestinian resistance and search for the realization of their basic rights, and in relation to the kind of movement that Al-Qaeda represented and ISIS to some extent succeeded them in representing in the region, a challenge to the post-colonial presence of the United States throughout the Islamic world. These two kinds of resistances, the resistance to Israeli domination of the Palestinians, converting their own, the Palestinian homeland into a country where they become the enemy and the stranger, and this effort by the United States to protect interests in oil and Israel and non-proliferation through establishing its military presence in the region, seeking regime change of governments that it didn't feel were friendly to Western interests, so that one had a new type of warfare that emerged after the Cold War, where the US was basically uncontested in the region, except for the people that were trying to resist. And that was true also for Israel in relation to the Palestinian people. So you had these two kinds of resistance struggles that did resort to violent tactics from time to time, and were used to validate recourse to political murder of the sorts we've been discussing. And it's not only the US and Israel. We saw the notorious case of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi Arabian citizen, leading journalist, who was executed in a barbaric fashion in the Turkish consulate in Istanbul while he was there trying to procure a marriage license. And this kind of murder, sanctioned by the state-sponsored terrorism, has basically fallen beneath the radar. The UN seemed helpless to do anything effective except to clarify the legal and political character of these events. And the geopolitical horizons are such that the US and Israel have not been effectively challenged in the reliance on such tactics. So it really poses a world order emergency. How does one address this kind of technology and lack of accountability for carrying out these kind of drone strikes, where there is no real opportunity for retaliation except by escalating a conflict and risking war as a consequence. There were efforts in the United States as in the course of the Cold War, to challenge the right of the CIA to engage in practices such as targeted assassinations or torture in overseas black sites. So that this is not something new as far as the assassinations are concerned. What is new is the fact of conflict being increasingly carried on by reliance on drone technology and by efforts to find individuals in hostile countries that can be eliminated as a way of both weakening the capacity of that country to function effectively and to demoralize and antagonize it. Not only was General Soleimani killed at the outset of 2020, but 9 months later, Israel apparently was responsible for the targeted killing of Iran's most senior nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. And that killing was carried out on the ground in Iran with a remotely exploded munition of some sort. And again, this was a clear violation of Iranian sovereignty. It was victimized an individual who, although he had some connection with the Iranian military, was essentially a scientist. It was not the first time that Israel engaged in such behavior. And they claimed that they were that their relationship with Iran entitles them to act in this fashion because they're in what they called a virtual state of war. But this is a one-sided war. Israel has not suffered any consequences from Iranian efforts to destroy targets, either persons or property in Israel. And it represents part of a broader effort to destabilize this political situation in Iran, and shows the weakness of the international institutions and international law in dealing with this kind of behavior on the part of leading governments. And it's a very unfortunate breakdown in law and in morality that has great consequences, both for those that are targeted, but also for the kind of peaceful world that one would like to see emerge. And this whole relationship of treating state-related individuals as appropriate targets and not considering that to be an act of war in violation of the UN Charter is something extremely damaging to the quality of world order, as is the failure of the UN to be able to do anything effective in response. It's one thing to condemn the human rights violation involved in such state-sanctioned or state-sponsored murder of this sort. It's another thing to prevent political violence by one state against another. And that really the whole mission of the UN was a war prevention mission. And to look the other way when acts of this sort are committed seems to me quite shocking. And when a leader like President Trump takes credit for committing this kind of state-sanctioned murder, he should be subject to criminal indictment. Iran, I think, quite properly has issued a warrant for his arrest under governmental authority and has sought to enlist Interpol in securing the cooperation of police forces around the world in securing his arrest and eventual extradition for indictment and prosecution in Iran. It's doubtful whether this kind of effort will bring success, but it does suggest what would be legitimate under these circumstances. What would be legitimate would be some way of holding individuals and governments accountable for violations of international human rights of this severity. It amounts to a crime against humanity, which was one of the three categories of crimes that the International Criminal Court has the jurisdiction to address. And it was the basis of the war crimes tribunals that dealt with German Nazi criminals after World War II, and also Japanese accused of war crimes, including crimes against humanity. So the question I think that one needs to address is, can civil society do something effective by calling attention to this kind of behavior? I think civil society and human rights NGOs have been very important in prohibiting torture as a regular instrument of state power. They haven't been altogether successful by any means, but they have exerted significant influence. But so far, the idea of political assassinations have been in this gray zone between war and peace, and have basically been validated by the media, mainstream media, as part of anti-terrorism. And it's not accidental, I suppose, that Trump, in addressing objections to the Soleimani assassination, relied on a completely fallacious anti-terrorist rationalization for carrying out this violent act. But what seems to me to be at this stage of great importance is to try to bring drone technology under some kind of international regulatory regime. It is posing great dangers not only by its use in a variety of countries, but by the United States, and other governments have begun to use it, but it could actually create a chaotic global situation if lots more non-state actors gain access to this technology, and as it develops more sophisticated ways of delivering explosives and engaging not only in targeted killing of individuals, but carrying out major acts of war against large targets. If you think of 9/11 as carried out by these hijackings of planes in the United States, you can imagine the havoc that would have resulted had the attacks been carried out by drones. But that's exactly what the US has been doing in Afghanistan, Yemen, and several other sites where it feels that hostile elements are at work opposing US interests in the world. So there is a world order challenge, it seems to me, that one hopes can be addressed now in a more moderate governing process in the US. It has to also deal with the way in which Israel has carried out these kind of terrorist operations. And that's not to overlook the fact that some governments have used targeted methods to assassinate their enemies, including Putin's Russia and Duterte's Philippines, and other dictatorial and autocratic governments have dealt with their own opponents in this way. And that raises a less inflammatory issue, because it's a matter of constituted governments dealing unlawfully with their own opponents. It is a violation of international human rights law, but it's a violation that I think is part of the internal political life of these countries and is very hard to deal with. In the case of Putin, he has apparently been associated with the poisoning of his opponents fairly recently with Navalny in London. He didn't die, he recovered eventually, but it was definitely an attempted murder. So we see a lot of these kinds of violent activities that are detrimental to human security, detrimental to world peace, and undermining of international law in a very spectacular way. And they are events that should be unconditionally repudiated by public opinion and by the responsible media. Unfortunately, in the killing of General Soleimani, the liberal Western press did accept part of Trump's rationale. They didn't look beneath the surface of the contention that Soleimani was a terrorist, because it's true that he reinforced resistance to the American occupation of Iraq, and that resulted in the death of some American armed forces. But that was a way of conducting a war of resistance against an occupation and against a attack on a country that had not been authorized by the UN, was an act of aggression by the United States, and resistance to aggression is something that is within the rights of a people and should be respected. So that we need an educational process as well as a political process, so as to understand what constitutes legitimate resistance and legitimate political activity for Israel to feel it can kill nuclear scientists working in Iran while it has its own arsenal of nuclear weapons, suggests a rather grotesque double standard that exists within the region and cannot really persist without very harmful consequences. So let me end here and look forward to questions and really emphasize or underscore my central observation that targeted killing of individuals in third-party countries lacking political consent to violation of sovereign rights is an appalling human tragedy and a crime against humanity.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Richard Falk, for covering a number of areas and number of topics and regions around the world, and number of places where this has actually taken place. You've also mentioned and raised the question, I guess, about the civil society and what needs to be done within civil society and so on. And I also have with us Masood Shajari, Chair of the Islamic Human Rights Commission, and he's going to be speaking just briefly, about 5 to 10 minutes or so, to address maybe some of the issues that are also raised by this from a human rights perspective. And then after that, we'll go to questions. You've been more than good, Professor Richard Falk. You've finished well within the time frame of that, and with that leaves us open for a few more questions at the end. So without further ado, if I can ask Masood Shajari, of the Chair of the Islamic Human Rights Commission, to say a few words before we go to the question and answer session. Thank you. I'm not sure if it's possible to hear.
I don't hear it.
Yeah, I'm not hearing anything at the moment. There seems to be a technical hitch. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Right, okay. Sorry about that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor for such a fantastic contribution. He actually covered all the bases and very eloquently. I just wanted to sort of, if I may, sort of talk about the fact that unfortunately, for a very long time, we have been sleepwalking into sort of assassination as a preferred tool. And this sort of was to some extent legitimized by use of drone in Afghanistan and in the masses at the time of George W. Bush, and then at the time of Obama. In the first few months, the number of drone attack was increased to the extent that in the first 4 months, there was more drone attacks than there was at the whole period of George W. Bush's sort of presidency. And unfortunately, matters are getting worse. One of the arguments that are being used is that, there is the admission that there are sort of casualties, civilian casualties, and the figures are being put something in the region of 75% sort of innocent people are being killed by these drone attacks. But I'll put it to you that the reality is that 100% of the people who are being killed are innocent, because none of them have been taken to court. None of them have been presented with accusation. None of them had had the opportunity to defend themselves. So we have had the arrogance of new colonial powers using sort of these tools to be judge, jury, and executioner, and creating havoc. The other point I want to actually make is that one of the excuses are used is that this contributes to peace and tranquility around the world. This is what they are arguing. They're arguing that by targeting so-called self-appointed terrorists, they are basically bringing more peace and tranquility. And evidence for that actually is non-existence. The reality is that we are seeing more and more sort of chaos and the destruction of the civil society and institutions in the places like Afghanistan, Iraq, places like Libya, Syria, and actually has created sort of more killing, more havoc, more creation of groups like Daesh, etc. And I think that is another point that we need to sort of say that there is really no evidence whatsoever. In specifically, when Professor was dealing with the issue of what has happened in the recent months and recent years in Iran and the assassination of Sardar Soleimani, yes, it's very clear that the overwhelming majority of people in that region, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and beyond, have seen him as a savior against Daesh, a savior against extreme sort of murderous groups. And so therefore, to actually assassinate him, it really removes someone that not just being loved by people in the way that we have to say that his funeral was the biggest funeral in the whole world. It never have been such a funeral for such a person in such a large number. People weeping, crying, and actually standing for what support he had provided. But also the point that I want to make is that assassination, and indeed assassination of Fakhrizadeh and other scientists, was not designed to create a more stable or peaceful environment. It was exactly opposite. It was actually designed to provoke a war, a conflict, extend the conflict, increase the conflict. And it was for that reason that these sort of execution took place. We know that by taking a general or a personality of any country, be it US or Iran or anywhere else, you don't change the history, you don't change the policy, you don't bring any change whatsoever. All you do, you provoke, and you actually try to create an all-out war. And that brings me to another thing. We need to differentiate between use of drone in the war environment, where there is a war, and use of these assassination and drones and other assassination at the time of peace. By international law, there is a lot of difference between these two aspects. And finally, I want to add something else, and that is that we hear all the time from international community that they're waiting to wait to see what Iran is going to do. But the fact is this: what is the international community is going to do? This is not just the interrelationship between Iran and United States or Israel, and indeed not even between Iran and the West. This is an issue that we are sleepwalking to an arena that once is legitimized, assassinating to provoke the other side, assassinating unlawfully individuals who are innocent by international definition, then we are actually going to go down the route that this becomes acceptable tool. Once becomes acceptable tool, then it's going to be used by everyone. And then we're going to have, instead of international law and the relationship, we're going to have the law of jungle. And this is exactly the direction that we are going because of the silence of the international community and UN in particular. I think that all of us, we need to increase pressure on UN and to say to them, the failure to address this issue promptly and adequately, they are going to be the reason, they are going to be the instrument that legitimizes this to take place and actually become a part of acceptable behavior by the governments around the world. And I want to add one more thing. We have had attempt of assassination allegedly by Russia and others. And which have been dealt with a different standard. International community, for whatever it's worth, was articulating the unacceptability of those behavior. I think what we are seeing is the role of Islamophobia in legitimizing these behavior, because overwhelming majority of those who are being targeted and assassinated unlawfully around the world are indeed Muslims. And I would put to you that this is an underlying reason that the international community is less concerned than they would have been if these assassination was targeting white Europeans. And I think that is also is something that I find it difficult even to articulate. I'm embarrassed to articulate that our world community and international law and UN and the international community is indeed Islamophobic. I'll leave it to this. I think every other aspect has been fantastically covered by the professor. But only thing is left is I would say that we have a responsibility to urge and put pressure on the international community to stop sleepwalking the whole of the world into that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Masood, for that quite passionate kind of appeal that you've provided. Some questions have come in to myself with regards to some of this, and they're following on from Professor Richard Falk's talk. And one of the questions is referring to the point that you made with regards to the mission of the United Nations having been one of preventing war. That the mission of the United Nations and it's a violation of the UN Charter, that the mission has been to prevent war, but that this in itself that has actually taken place, some of these acts that you mentioned with the murder of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, etc., that clearly is not something that has been dealt with by the United Nations. Also, Brother Masood mentioned about that within the context of the international community, that can actually be done in the mechanisms of the United Nations to make something happen, to make the wheels of the United Nations on this primary issue of preventing war actually make that work. I mean, what can actually be done in terms of mechanisms is one of the questions that's been asked.
Well, that's a very important question. And before responding to it, I just want to say how much I appreciated what Brother Masood has brought into the discussion, and his phrase about sleepwalking into a dark future is a very potent and effective way of identifying how serious these issues are and how unfortunate has been their treatment up to this point. And I think he's onto something. Response is an expression of Islamophobic disregard, because the victims have largely been in the Islamic world. But that puts some responsibility on the rest of us to try to make this issue an issue that arouses a sense of moral outrage. As far as the UN doing something directly about this, one has to understand that the UN is a organization that is set up to be unable to act effectively against the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, of which the US is one, and because these 5 states that basically prevailed in World War II and are no longer really the representatives of the most important countries in the world, they have the legal authority, the constitutional authority, through their permanent membership in the Security Council and their right of veto to block any initiative that runs counter to their perceived national interests or geopolitical grand strategy. So we can't look to the UN as it's now constituted for more than a important but symbolic censure of behavior of this sort, and that has been forthcoming in the UN Human Rights Council as a result of the report made by the Special Rapporteur on this subject matter, Agnes Kalemard, last July. It's an important report that clearly condemns this kind of political assassination and treats it, in this case, with respect to General Soleimani, as an act of war. So the UN is important to legitimate civil society militancy that can alone put pressure on governments, including the governments that are responsible for this behavior. But it can to look to the UN to solve the problems by taking initiatives is to pursue something that is a mission impossible at this point, because it really doesn't have the authority or the mandate to challenge geopolitical policies and practices of this sort.
Thank you for that point. There's another question that has come in. You've mentioned in particular that Iran has issued an arrest warrant, and also something that hasn't been said in the question, but there's also been something issued from the Iraqi government as well on this issue. But perhaps you might shed light on that a little bit in your answer. But you also said that it is doubtful that it will bring results, the issuing of the arrest warrant and so on. So is it worth pursuing that when it's not going to bring results, is what the questioner is asking. What's the point?
Well, I think there's an ambiguity in the word results. What it cannot do is probably deliver the body of Donald Trump to Iran for a criminal prosecution. But what it can do is legitimate opposition and the criminalization of what he has done, and point to the inadequacy of the international community's capacity to address behavior of this sort. So it really says that the future of this kind of law enforcement is up to the peoples of the world, and one can't look with any kind of realistic hope to the UN or to the most powerful governments of the world that really don't want to interfere with each other's exercise of state power. So it's a complicated question, really, and one shouldn't draw from my response any impression that the UN is not valuable. It is valuable, but it's valuable within very strict limits. It can affect the legitimacy of behavior and and pronounce on the illegitimacy of behavior in an effective way. But what it can't do is challenge behaviorally the geopolitical actions of leading states and their close friends or allies. It can condemn what Israel does, for instance, to the Palestinians, but it can't change the policies of Israel or the US toward the Palestinians. That has to come from global solidarity and resistance by the Palestinians and those that are supporting that.
Okay. Thank you for that, Professor. One of the, Brother Masood, if I can bring you in on this particular point with regards to the issue of the arrest warrant and how useful that's going to be. The issue about results and what we mean by results, I think, has been articulated by Professor Richard Falk. What would you say with regards to this particular point?
I think absolutely very important, because I think we will see, I'm quite convinced that we're going to see other sort of accusations and indeed other charges against Trump in the near future. I think we really need to create an environment that is exposed for the criminality that he's been involved in. And I think that's the very important position for the civil society to be involved in. We need to make sure wherever he goes, he is not going to be sort of free to roam around. He should be identified by demonstrators, by others, and indeed put pressure on governments to highlight that he's not really wanted. The criminality that he's been involved in against international law and the way that where he has taken the United States, and then what he's done last Wednesday within United States itself. You know, he actually has become very arrogant, and I think if you allow tyrants like him, like Netanyahu, to actually get away with murder and creating havoc for perceived interest, then you're going to end up seeing them doing far more crimes. And I think it is very important for the international community and civil society to actually draw these lines of criminality. I totally agree with Professor. It really is actually a victory for the fact that international community and civil society sort of identify him and tag him for what he is.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Another question that's come in is kind of like, it was again referring to Professor Falk's talk on the issue of civil society. You've kind of alluded to it in some ways to the answer to this, but I'll raise the question and address it to Professor. Can civil society, what can civil society do on this issue? With regards to, you talked about it in your presentation, but what can actually be done that would be effective to counter this? Because civil society does not have as much power as obviously government would. So what would you say to this particular questioner?
Well, of course, it is a challenge to somehow crystallize effectively a mobilization of civil society that is alert about the importance of these developments. And as has been said by both of us, it's not only the killing of these individuals who are denied their fundamental human rights, but it's also letting loose on the world a kind of technology and normalization of systematic violence that is very threatening to the future of all of us. And it is giving way to these kind of suppressed but very real Islamophobic tropes that allow this kind of behavior to go under the radar of moral outrage. And I think one of the things that civil society is capable of doing, including in a country like the United States, is to raise this issue in such a way that governments don't have a green light to just flash the word terrorist on the screen and carry out murders of innocent people, because that's what they're doing. And not only innocent people, but people that have pursued distinguished and honorable careers. And in the case of General Soleimani, has been, as was pointed out, treated as a savior, beloved by his people, and something that is it is a shocking abuse of power to have directed this kind of violence. And it was accentuated, as I tried to mention, by the fact that he was on a peacekeeping mission at the very moment he was killed. He was trying to, at the invitation of the Prime Minister of Iraq, trying to resolve a conflict and reduce tensions in ways that, if they were not addressed, could spread even more violence in the region. And it's significant that this assassination in Iraq has changed the Iraqi attitude toward the whole American occupation and given rise to very important popular mobilization of Iraqi civil society demanding that the US remove its troops. And the Iraqi parliament has indicated support for such a rejection of the American presence, even though supposedly the Americans came to Iraq to liberate it from an autocratic leader, but instead has produced chaos and violence in the country, and in a way that is the very opposite of what it's claiming, what it claimed to be doing when it first attacked, without any UN support, incidentally.
And another question that's actually coming. Thank you for that. On that point, another question that's come in is with regards to the issue of drone technology that's been talked about, and I think the options that it's opened up for the presidents. In some ways, we've kind of like focused on the figure of Donald Trump, but at the same time, there's been was mentioned, I think, in Brother Masood's talk, the amount of escalation that had actually taken place under Obama with regards to the drone attacks that had taken place around the world and assassinations that had been done. Now, Joe Biden, and we've talked about the future, Joe Biden is coming in as president. I think he's due to come in and president as planned, but during Obama's administration, when these things actually took place. So, are you hopeful for the future? And it's been directed. Well, I'll ask both of you, but I think different parts of the question. Perhaps Richard Falk, if you could address that first.
I'm hopeful in certain limited spheres. I think Biden will be a great improvement domestically in terms of health policy in the midst of this COVID crisis. He will be less aggressive in polarizing the country, encouraging its most violent white supremacist elements. And in that way, I would be encouraged. I'm worried about his foreign policy, because I think he's likely to try to restore the kind of alliance structure that existed during the Cold War and reestablish a geopolitical agenda that risks a new Cold War possibly directed at China and maybe Russia too. And that has a lot of implications for the future. Among them, the decline of the US in terms of its international and domestic behavior is tied to this persistent overinvestment in the military. And it's had to exaggerate foreign security threats, including threats from the Islamic world, as a way of justifying keeping its budget, military budget, at this astronomical level during peacetime, where there are no real threats to the American homeland. It's a purely imperial policy driven by war industry, special interests, and a whole variety of other kind of forces. But the net result is this kind of military, the reliance on a military solution for political problems. That's been the essence of US foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, but worldwide. And it's increasingly so because the US has lost its legitimacy as a kind of global leader that it enjoyed after World War II. And since the end of the Cold War, I think has accentuated both the pursuit of what I call predatory capitalism plus global militarism, and therefore has very little capacity for solving the problems of the world in a constructive manner. Having just one more point, which is, having said that, I do think that Biden will be much more forthcoming on issues like climate change and on multilateralism generally than was true during the Trump period. But I think Brother Masood is absolutely right to attribute responsibility to Obama and George W. Bush for this normalization of drone warfare as a preferred alternative to conventional war.
Okay, if I can, thank you very much for that response. If I can ask Brother Masood to come in on that question.
Yes, I totally agree with Professor. I think there's going to be a change about domestic policies. International policies, I think we shouldn't hold our breath. Unfortunately, the geopolitical and the financial interests of the arm industry and others is going to force them into similar projects and similar direction as we have seen in past, as it was in the time of Obama. I mean, let us not forget Libya happened at the time of Obama, Syria, Yemen, so we shouldn't be holding our breath. But there is a but here. The but is that, we don't have someone like Trump in power. Trump just didn't give any time to any other opinion other than what he wanted to do. And we have seen that unleashed even when it comes to the elections in the United States. He has this alternative truth, and he pursue it to the end. I don't think we have the same issue with new administration. I think, therefore, it puts a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility on civil society and the rest of us, how we could convince the international community that the direction that we are going, it actually would lead us to chaos, and it will be detrimental to our lives, to our future. Look, we can't go around creating Libyas around the world or Syrias around the world. We can't do that just because one or two states in the region would like to sort of would like that. And I think we need to convince. And I think when it comes to the issue of assassination and target killing, we need to actually look at not just the cases of Sardar Soleimani. We need to look at all the cases. You know, if this becomes further legitimized around the world, we're going to have other state players getting involved in this. We are going to have a situation that is going to affect perceived interest of not just people in the Muslim world, but everywhere else. And I think it will be very difficult to say that it's okay if you do it in Middle East or here and there, but you couldn't do it, in Europe or elsewhere. That argument is going to be sort of not obtainable. And I think what we need to do, we need to convince that when we talk against assassination and target killing, you're talking about every single human being. And we actually condemn every state who actually gets involved in this. And therefore, those of us who are going to unite, we actually need to unite on those bases, rather than just on a basis of one or two personalities which have been forcibly removed from our midst in this barbaric way.
Thank you for that.
Can I add just a small point, which was, see, in one way, I think Biden is more dangerous than Trump. And that is because I fear that he's more of a captive of what I call the American version of the deep state. And the deep state in the US is the permanent part of the intelligence and military bureaucracy that sees the future of American foreign policy through this bipartisan consensus that existed during the Cold War for 4 decades. And they now want to resurrect it to confront China and maybe Russia too. And that's very dangerous. See, Trump was a sufficient maverick for the reasons that were well expressed, that he didn't want, he rejected. That's why those people, the security elite in America, opposed Trump's election in 2016 and again in 2020, because he was breaking this kind of global militarist alliance that created this permanent international security threat that in turn allowed the military budget in peacetime to stay higher than the next 10 countries combined. It's an extraordinary diversion of resources when the US infrastructure, as the COVID crisis revealed, is deteriorating at a very rapid rate, and it has handled this crisis worse than any other important country in the world.
Thank you for that, Professor. One point has come up, one question that's come up. It says that you mentioned in your talk, Professor, that there were no consequences suffered by Israel in terms of the actions that it's carried out against Hamas officials in different countries, and also against the Iranian scientists, most notably the recent one of Fakhrizadeh, as you mentioned. In that absence of there being no consequence suffered, how can Israel suffer a consequence, is the question that's being asked.
Well, the short answer to that would be the same way that South Africa suffered consequences for its apartheid system. It's not that it is the moral outrage of the world community is an effective, more effective instrument than the complaints of governments. And if that can be mobilized, not just around this issue, but the other issues that we've talked about, that can make a difference in a way that changes the internal forces within Israel itself. See, a part of what happened in South Africa was that the international campaign led the South African elite to recalculate their own interests. They didn't have a moral awakening. They had a pragmatic awakening that they'd be better off having a multiracial constitutional governing system than they would be carrying on this kind of racist regime and becoming a pariah to the rest of the world. See, and I think that's what when the global solidarity movement with the Palestinians struggle and the BDS movement, they're all part of this effort to mobilize moral outrage at what Israel and the US are doing in these various contexts, one of the most important of which we've been discussing tonight.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Professor. Brother Masood, is there anything you want to mention on this particular point?
Yeah, I just want to highlight, look, things are changing in the region. Let us not forget that, the Iraq War, the Iraqis saw United States as liberators, or at least some of them did, very sizable majority of them or section of them did. That perception is not there any longer in Iraq. People want them out, as Professor said. The Parliament has voted against the sort of continuation of troops, American troops in Iraq, and the people genuinely see them as not a positive representation in the region. They have brought chaos, destruction. Same thing in Libya and elsewhere. I think that understanding, it's a very important understanding. They're losing the hearts and minds of people in Middle East. And I think that is actually a very important awakening, which really ensuring that United States as a colonial power is losing its power and is it has to disengage from that region. That is actually a significant win for the indigenous population in the region.
Okay, that's great. And I think one final question that's been asked is with regards to the issue of Qasem Soleimani. And the question is with regards to the fact that nothing can practically some steps have been taken, but the issue has been that Iran has actually promised that there will be devastating vengeance, if you like, for this, and that has as yet not been carried out. How do you interpret this retaliation in the absence of international frameworks to deal with this issue and Iran's stance on this particular point? Professor Richard Falk.
Well, as was said earlier, the failure of the world community to act effectively in response to an outrage of this sort leaves Iran with very little alternative but to engage in some kind of unilateral undertaking that expresses the fact that they will not tolerate this kind of behavior, challenging the lives of their most revered citizens. At the same time, Iran is interested, as it's made clear, the Prime Minister Rouhani has made clear, that they're eager for the US to rejoin this joint comprehensive program of action, which is coupled with the ending of sanctions. Iran, you have to remember, has been under crippling sanctions that are themselves questionable legally and certainly morally. And their own people have suffered for a very long period as a result of that. So they have several diverse interests to pursue, only one of which is to retaliate in some way at the moment of their choosing for what happened to Soleimani. But the other is to get out from under this kind of coercive diplomacy that's been directed at their society for such a long period of time, and which has been championed by Israel and Saudi Arabia and UAE and others, so that it's a tactical question as to how to balance these various challenges that face the leadership of Iran at this point.
Okay, thank you. Brother Masood, would you like to come in on this point from a human rights angle?
Yeah, well, the fact of the matter is, I have said this before, that it really is up to Iran how to respond to this, and their moral and sort of international right is to respond. But I think we shouldn't actually make this an issue between Iran and the rest of the world, or between Iran and United States. We need to actually tackle this as something that affects every single one of us. And I think also it's I'm not saying that this should be the response, or this is because I really don't know what is planning, but we need to look at the bigger picture. If United States is kicked out of the region with tails between its legs, and that is actually a very substantial sort of win for the region, because they have brought nothing except suffering and death and destruction to the region. I mean, look at one by one the countries in the region. Look at even Afghanistan and so forth. They really have brought no tranquility or peace and so forth. So if that happened as a result of this, I think that is actually a substantial win for the humanity. But I think the rest of us need to make sure that this type of action will be something that the international community will not legitimize. And as I said, we should stop sleepwalking into a very dark space if everyone starts behaving in the same way that Israelis and Americans are doing.
Thank you very much indeed for responding to those number of questions that have been asked of yourselves. Really appreciate that. Thank you very much, Professor Richard Falk, for the valuable presentation that you made at the start, and the detailed way that you covered this particular topic, and brought to light and brought together, I think, from historical kind of angle, the way things have actually happened with regards to state-sanctioned murder, and with the examples that you brought to the table, and also to the way that you've answered the questions. I would also like to thank Brother Masood Shejeri with regards to his comments on some of the questions, and also the presentation that he made. That's it from us with regards to the webinar. Thank you to the audience for listening, participating, and for in particular, the questions, the interaction. I hope that you found it useful. Apologies if any questions have not been responded to in this time, but we have run out of time. So thank you again to Brother Masood, and in particular to Professor Richard Falk, and hopefully we'll be able to meet again at some point in the future with regards to doing a future webinar. Thank you indeed. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Thank you.